Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel after a very long while. Where today I hope that people do not follow me as for directions to actually make a plushie, but just listen to the fact that I'm gonna read, rant, and kind of review what was the book To The Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf about. Hope you like the video, and if you do, please leave a like and also share your views for this book because when I was reading this book, I had so many mixed emotions where I liked some of it, but most of the time it was genuinely a pain to read. A little bit of background on the book. This was first published in 1927 by the Hogarth Press, and this publishing house was owned and also run by Virginia Woolf and her husband. And as much as I see people in the modern times appreciating this work, it was not the same when it came to the time that it was first published. This was mainly due to the fact that while critics were very fascinated and in love with the experimental style of Woolf and the way she captured consciousness itself and how she, projected the inner emotions into a vivid narrative. On the other hand, when we look at the general public, it wasn't an easy read at all. Many readers found it confusing and even disorienting because when we look and assume what a novel is supposed to be, it is supposed to follow a plot and traditional dialogue, which is not present here, leading to the general public being more confused about this book than usual. So, starting off with understanding what is the setting, the major characteristics, and what is happening in each part is really necessary to understand the depth of this text. So, let's set the basic situation and how the novel takes place. Similar to the title of the book, the whole plot revolves around Ramsay's summer house on an island in the Hebrides, which is based off of the Isle of Skye in Scotland. The house looks out across a bay to a lighthouse on a small island, and that lighthouse, which is visible but also at the same time very distant, functions as a recurring focal point, which is the simple physical destination that carries emotional weight for different characters. The time frame of the book roughly covers a decade around the First World War, and the actions opens before the war and jumps forward about 10 years and then returns in the three parts that it possesses. Moving on to the characters of the book, you will see people interact in this stream of consciousness in the book. So there are going to be a lot of characters, but when we focus on the main characters of this book, it revolves around Mrs. Ramsay and Ramsay's family and the people she most interacts with. So, starting off with Mrs. Ramsay, she's a very warm and charismatic person. She's very social and she's the emotional center of the house. She tends and comforts others and orchestrates the domestic life in this whole novel. The second main character you can see is Mr. Ramsay, who is a very reflective and also a very insecure philosopher and an academic. He's a very brusque person at times, needing reassurance about his intellectual legacy. And there was this one passage that I enjoyed a lot because it was very reflective of my own mind when it is in turmoil, or to be honest, when I'm facing an existential crisis. Then we come to the third character, which is James Ramsey. He's the youngest son at the start of the book, about the age of 6, and he basically adores his mother and resents his father's harshness. Then we have another character from the Ramsey family, which is Cam, also known as Camilla. She's one of the younger daughters and appears mostly in the later section of the book. And then we have Lily Briscoe. She's a young woman and a painter. She's a friend of Mrs. Ramsey and a key viewpoint character. And her paintings represent a thread of thought in themselves throughout the book. Other than these few characters, we have Charles Tansley, who is the student of Mr. Ramsey, and he's generally coming off as a very obnoxious person, especially to Lily. Then we have Paul Rayleigh and Minta Royal, who are young friends, or you could say guests, and Mrs. Ramsey is seen at the start of the book kind of pushing them towards getting engaged to each other. Then we have Augustus Carmichael, I don't know how to pronounce his name, and William Banks. These are other guests, which is basically a poet and a botanist, respectively, which represents a wider social circle and generally appears in part 1 rather than part 3 or 2. Aside from these few characters, we also have several other Ramses, children, and visitors, but the novel's attention shifts from among many inner lives rather than following a single external action. Because, as I said earlier, it is a stream of conscious rather than following a plot of the book. Before I dive into further details about the book, I'm just going to mention what is actually going on in the video itself. I was actually in the process of making a plushy amigurumi cow, and as much as I would like it to be kind of pretty and all, this was my first try at a figure after a very long while, and all the practice that I had with the crochet hook just kind of evaporated. So, this is me actually struggling a lot more than usual trying to make a very simple plushie, which is supposed to be beginner friendly. But as it stands, this is mostly a struggle, and also the fact that the tutorial pattern that I was following was incomplete, and I was left with a lot of like plot holes in this tutorial itself that I had to fix. And in the end, you will see the product that I was left with, and I'll also put a reference picture of what is supposed to be and what I think it actually turned out to be. Going back to the structure of the book, let's move on to the parts of the book and what happens scene by scene. So, in part 1, we have the window, which is about the house, one long evening, and the days around it. This section of the book opens in the Ramses' summer house and spends a long time inside the house, showing how the family is interacting, the dinners, the conversations, and many interior thoughts. The crucial early incident is very small and seemingly very domestic. It is the fact that James is asking if they'll go to the lighthouse tomorrow. And while Mrs. Ramsey tells him they will if the weather is fine, Mr. Ramsey bluntly insists that the weather will be bad without even checking the weather. And that small contradiction produces a sting for James because he loves his mother's promise, but at the same time, he kind of dreads his father's dismissal. And it creates a tension that is repeatedly returned to throughout the book. The other scenes and rhythms that we find in part 1 is that we meet the circle of guests and family and the conversation which are held in the morning, afternoon, and an extended evening dinner party. And where we see Mrs. Ramsey quietly managing the social life, where she's comforting some people and pairing others, like she did with Paul and Doily towards engagement, and smoothing disagreements and basically being a very good mediator and protecting the children's world. Looking at the other stream of conscious in part 1 is Lily Briscoe and how she tries to paint a portrait of Mrs. Ramsey and James. Throughout the evening, we see her battling her doubts about her art and her artistic struggles, especially in the face of the claims made by Charles Stanley, who thinks that women cannot paint. The other theme is that the novel frequently moves into a stream of consciousness. As I mentioned, we move on from the thoughts of Mrs. Ramsay to Briscoe, and we inhabit characters' interior impressions and memories and small associations. On the surface, relatively little action occurs, but the section maps social ties and the power dynamics, especially in the context of Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey, and the emotional background of the household. This section closes on an evening note where people are dispersing into their rooms, lamps are being put out, and the house is alive with small domestic dramas. And then we move on to part 2, which is Time Passes, where we see a 10-year leap and the effects of war and the decay that the house is facing in the absence of Mrs. Ramsey. Due to the 10-year leap, there is a radical structural jump, and instead of following characters minute by minute as we did in part 1, we see that the author is compressing about 10 years into a very brief, very lyrical, and sometimes a very fragmentary sequence. In this section, we see that the summer house is empty for years, and the seasons and the weather are described rather than actually felt through. And we see that dust is gathering on the house, and the house is deteriorating, while life outside the house undergoes a very catastrophic change. And that is due to the fact that the First World War has occurred off stage, and in this process, two of the Ramsey children have also been killed, and that is for two various reasons. Where Andrew is killed in the war, Prue dies in childbirth, and also we see the demise of Mrs. Ramsey during this interval. And the losses are not directly taken into this book, it is very indirect. And the author uses absence and silence and images of ruin to convey the effects of grief and the passage of time. So we see how this section is very compressing when it comes to the grief and the public catastrophe and private decay into the mediation on how time alters human plans and memory. The family roles are actually just reshuffled. The house becomes very unhomely, and the artistic energy that Lily had is kind of stalled, and she's not able to finish the painting due to the loss of Mrs. Ramsey. The focus of this section is more on how daily life can fade and how continuity can break in the face of catastrophes. The novel quickly moves on to the part 3, which is The Lighthouse, where we return to the summer house, the journey, and small closures that we see in the face of everything that has happened since the loss faced by the family and the people around the novel, and also the war. In the final part, the surviving family members and a few guests return to the summer house, and the time span, as I said, is 10 years later. The central idea of part 3 is basically the voyage to the lighthouse, which has been talked about from part 1 itself. This trip is taken mainly by Mr. Ramsey at the helm of it, and it involves James and Camilla as the main central points of this story. While the lighthouse trip itself is small and ordinary in outward action, they hire a local boat and set across the water with a couple of sailors. But for the character, it crystallizes emotional movement, where we see James, who once longed for the lighthouse and resented his father's dismissiveness, now steering and keeping the boat steady. Mr. Ramsey, who often demeans him at one point, genuinely praises James. That small exchange changes their relationship in a very subtle way. Meanwhile, Lily Briscoe completes the painting she had been struggling with for years. The act of finishing the canvas at the moment the boat reaches the lighthouse acts as a kind of artistic and emotional closure. The painting is not a grand triumph, you could say, but a personal resolution that refuses the idea that one must secure immortal fame. She sees the work as enough for her own vision. And with this, the novel ends on a quite sad note, you could say, with the physical journey being made and small reconciliations happening at the same time, and the characters live with the fact of loss and change. To be honest, when I read the novel, understanding the plot itself was very hard. But when I recount all of this, you can understand that the novel isn't plotless, but the author hides most historical events offstage, which is the war and the death. Those events are felt through absence, echoes, and the changed relationship rather than showing as a dramatic scene. So when you read, looking for shifts in how people inhabit rooms and who speaks and the small gestures that mark time, it explains how the plot is developing, even though it is hard to grasp at times. So I started reading this book generally to get a grasp of what is the writing of Virginia Woolf like and why is it so famous, because I had seen a lot of people just talk about it. But even as I was reading it, I was questioning my thought process again and again, because this book is not easy to read. And as someone who has not long been into reading a lot and just doing it as a hobby, I thought that this was a very hard read for myself. And it was a challenge to myself to actually get into the kind of novels that I generally don't read. And I started off with this, and the core message that I could understand that the author is trying to say, what is the main message or the theme here, is to show how life is built not from grand events but from fleeting internal moments. And that is projected through thoughts and perceptions and memories that shape who we are. In this book, we can see that the author is trying to dissolve the boundaries that we have in terms of external reality and inner consciousness. And when it comes to the worldview or ideology that is coming from the author, I think Woolf's worldview is very deep and modernistic when it comes to how she believes the reality is subjective. She portrays that each person, through the stream of consciousness, has a very different experience of the world, and the truth is honestly very fragmented when we look at every individual's mind. She also introduces a very subtle feminist ideology, if you could see, in the sense that Mrs. Ramsey and Lily Briscoe, two of the most opposite people I could understand, because while Mrs. Ramsey can be a person who embodies traditional womanhood, where she is a very nurturing person, she's emotional, she is domestic, and Lily Briscoe is more along the lines of representing independence and creative ambition. We can understand from the text itself that Woolf doesn't condemn it or validate anything, but she just says on paper how these both exist in the same time frame, and both of these are acceptable in social context. Another question that pops into my head when I'm actually reading this book is, what is the author trying to say? What is the main message or theme? And for me, when reading this book, I think the author is trying to tell us that life isn't built out on big events, it's built out of moments that we experience. Like these tiny, almost invisible fragments, a passing glance or a half finished sentence, a memory you don't even realize matters until later. She's saying that meaning doesn't come from what happens, but from how we feel it when it happens. Like, for example, in the start, in the earlier period of the book itself, we see Mrs. Ramsey sitting by the window, knitting and thinking. It's not very dramatic, but you feel the weight of her whole existence in that stillness. She's thinking about her children, her husband, the dinner she's going to make, and somehow it feels like the author is saying that this serene and this very normal lifestyle is what life is. This is where we find our core ideas and meaning when we live the life that we have. So, the message that I could understand is the author is not saying that life is about big world changing events, but it is more about finding permanence inside the ordinary. As we can observe from the fact that she didn't focus on World War I, but rather the impact on the family, how they grieve, how they process everything. And from this, I would like to lead into her worldview, which feels very modern and honest. Everyone in the book lives inside their own mind, seeing the world differently. Taking the example of Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey, they love each other deeply, but they can never quite meet in the middle. There's this part where he wants to say, I love you, but she can't. She just says, yes, you were right, and somehow that's enough. I think this is the way that the author is saying that connection doesn't always need to be spoken outright. Sometimes it is just a feeling. Then we have Lily Briscoe, the painter, and through her, we can see the hint of feminism that the author is trying to represent. In the face of people telling Lily that she cannot paint, or women in usual cannot paint and women cannot write, she doesn't argue, she just keeps working. She has her own hiccups in this passage, but at the same time, she understands that this is what is really persistent for her, what is really natural to her. And that, I think, is the author's own way of projecting that feminism ideology, that feminist ideology. It is not like very extreme, but it is very subtle and persistent. Her worldview is that truth and meaning are personal and we create them ourselves. And honestly, I think this is the kind of idea that I totally agree upon. What's fascinating though is how the worldview turns into the book's larger message that memory is what really defines us. We see the idea and the memory of Mrs. Ramsey's death happening almost silently, and it is just bracketed line in time passes. And in the bracket itself, it mentions Mrs. Ramsey died suddenly the night before, but she never leaves the story outright. And we see that people have these lingering thoughts about her, especially when we look at the perspective and thoughts of Lily. There's this line near the end of the book where Lily whispers, Mrs. Ramsey, it was her doing, as she paints and reflects on the events that are happening at the time. And it shows how people live on the inside, and how even after a person has passed away onto the afterlife, they shape our thoughts and how they lead us through our lives even without their presence in physical form. And I think this whole idea is really beautiful, but at the same time, I'm gonna be really honest when I say I didn't enjoy the process of reading this book as much as I wanted to. The writing didn't always connect with me on a very personal level. It's not that the book isn't good, it absolutely is when we look at it from a general perspective. It is very layered, it is very thoughtful, it's full of meaning, but for me, it feels a little distant from the present time. The language is very heavy, the pace is very slow, and sometimes I feel like I was watching the characters from behind the glass instead of really being with them and understanding them and visualizing them. Still, the way that the author builds the story reflects the whole message of the memory and time perfectly. The novel moves from three sections that we see: the window, time passes, and the lighthouse, and each of them feels like a different way of experiencing life. In the first part, we see that there is warmth and there is movement. People are talking, they are planning, and they are connecting. Then we see the second part, which entails the shifting, and everything just strips into nothingness. The house goes silent, the people kind of fade in and out, and after years go by, almost unnoticed, we see and reach the lighthouse. What's left feels very quiet, more fragile, like all that's left are the memories of who they were and the echoes of what used to matter. And the last part, the lighthouse, it's really where everything comes together. The moment the family makes the trip years later, it's not even reaching about the lighthouse anymore. The meaning of it has completely changed. When James finally sees it, it's not this bright, perfect symbol he imagined as a child. It's very small, it's quieter, very ordinary, but that is what makes it so unique, so real. It's like the author is saying that life never quite turns out the way that we dream it will, and maybe that is okay. The whole structure of the novel feels like this slow movement, but at the same time, it is so fast in the way that we go from one evening dinner to 10 years to the lighthouse being like just a small part of it. You start in this crowded, warm space full of people and voices, and by the end, everything slows down into this soft, lingering quiet. And even though I didn't always connect with the writing itself, I do think that the structure is powerful. It mirrors the way that time moves in real life, how it stretches and collapses, how one moment can last forever and a decade can disappear in a single line. I kind of have been experiencing this same feeling myself when I started this year with a lot of things happening around me. And then now suddenly the time has slowed down a lot, but at the same time, it feels like the time is kind of stretching and slowly disappearing. And that is something I did enjoy in the middle. In that middle section, when we talk about time passes, when the house is empty and the narrative shifts away from the people entirely, that to me is where the author's technique really stood out to me. We don't really see the characters actually dying. We just get these brief, almost casual mentions. And it's very jarring, but it's also kind of brilliant because it forces you to confront the way time moves on without ceremony, how the world just keeps going whether you're ready or not. And I think that's where this book fits so strongly into modernist literature. That whole movement was about breaking away from neat plots and fixed endings. The author isn't interested in telling you what actually happens. She's trying to show you how it feels. Every thought, every pause, every shifting perspective, it's all about capturing the consciousness as it actually happens. As I've mentioned this before, I do admire it, but again, it's not an easy book to read. It genuinely demands a lot of patience. It doesn't give you clear answers or a sense of closure, which is something that frustrates me a lot. I tend to read a lot of fictional works which is more focused on concluding the plot as the normal novel is supposed to be. And this novel genuinely made me feel like I am drifting through people's minds with no real destination. And that's the part of why it was hard for me to love it in the same way others do. I can respect what it's doing, it's very different, it's very new, it's very genius in their own way, but it's not the kind of story that emotionally anchors me or something that I will return to again and again. Still, even with that, I cannot deny the beauty of how it all ends when Lily finishes her painting and says, I have had my vision. It feels like quite a resolution. It's not like it's projected out from the lighthouse itself, but it's a very gentle way of telling about her painting. It is not focused on the success or the failure, but about finally seeing something clearly, even if it is for only that moment. And that, I think, is the real lighthouse of the story. That flash of understanding, brief but brilliant, before everything fades away again. I also want to talk about the crochet pieces that I'm doing recently and the books that I have read aside from To the Lighthouse. I had my hands upon The Vegetarian by Hang Kang, and I think that I would like to review it in the future because it is a book that I want to analyze critically. I enjoyed this book so much, and at times I had this feeling of almost goosebumps when I was reading this because this book was very uncanny, but at the same time, I could see the reflections of society, how patriarchal society and societal norms can shape a woman, and how going against them in an act which is can be as simple as not eating meat can make your view on society change and can change the way that society interacts with you. It was very interesting. I think I would give this book a 5 out of 5. And in terms of To the Lighthouse, I would say that book is like a 1 out of 5 for me. I don't think that I will ever pick it up again or recommend it to any new beginners as a reader. I would think that this is the kind of book that you kind of read because you have to, in terms of like as an assignment rather than a light read, which is something that maybe I should work upon. Maybe I should read more literary text that is interactive, that makes me think a lot more. And a friend of mine actually talked about how these kinds of books are generally the kind of books that you reflect back on rather than enjoy at the moment. So maybe I'll update you more on my thought process when it has marinated in my mind for a bit. Aside from these two very insightful and I would say, in my opinion, heavy text, I also read a series by Christy Cunning. It was The Four Psychos. Very light read, to be honest. It has some plot holes, but at the same time, I think it was much needed in the light of the books that I just talked about. This book revolved around the idea of apocalypse and the four horsemen. It was generally very easy to get through. I think I finished two books at once, the first installment and the second one. It started off as not very general in terms of what I imagine a book about apocalypse and four horsemen would be. It was very funny at the start because I'm watching from the perspective of a ghost. And then it turned out to be kind of predictable because I think the whole plot point did revolve around Lucifer and the trials of hell. But it was a nice read. It was kind of relaxing my mind after investing so much of it into these two books. So, this is all the book drama that I have experienced recently. And yeah, this is me trying to salvage this crochet, even though I could see at this moment that the shape is not what it's supposed to be. So, I'll show you the picture that it is supposed to be. And while I was like completing this project, to be honest, when I was stitching it up, I thought that it looked more like the game caterer's character that you see on the Korean variety show. Much, I would think that it's much familiar or similar to that. So, anyway, it was a crochet fail. The book read also, I would say, was a fail because I didn't find my new, like, bestie author, I could say, the author that I would read more books from. But at least it's not as bad as Icebreaker, so I think it will be fine. If you've read any of the books that I mentioned and you have your own opinions, do not hesitate to comment down below. I would love to chat with you guys and know your opinions on these books. And if you liked my video, you can leave a like, you can subscribe, and I hope to see you soon. I know it's been a while since my last video, and honestly, I just needed some time to settle in and get my head back into it, to actually want to talk about things again. But I'm really glad to be back, and I hope to see you guys soon, and hopefully a lot sooner than the last time I disappeared off the internet. Bye bye.